We are beginning today's Shiur in Siman Ches. We are up to Sivav, the top line on page Yudalad. It's the page following 26. The Mechaber says in Sivav, Al talis koton yochol levarech lehisatev, af al pi she'enu misatev ela lovsho. On a talis koton, what we call Tzitzis, you can make the bracha of lisatev Tzitzis, even though we don't wear it on our heads, we only wear it around our bodies. And the Ramah says, V'yesh omrim shemevarachin olav al mitzvahs Tzitzis. Some say the bracha on the talis koton is not lehisatev Tzitzis, but rather al mitzvahs Tzitzis, v'cheino hagin, and that is our custom. V'ein l'shanos, and one should not change from that minhag. Says the Mishna Berura of Koton Tezayin El Lovsho. We said we only wear it around our bodies. V'habrocha hi lehisatev ki nusach habrocha kachu kumolesha basukah. Even though we're not wrapping our heads in it, the bracha of lehisatev is a general bracha that goes for putting on the tzitzis. The same way we have a bracha of leisha basukah that you'll make even if you're standing in the sukkah. That is the matbeya of the bracha that they were masakin. But if Koton Yuzayin goes on the Ramah that says on a talis koton, the minhag is to make a bracha of al mitzvah tzitzis. Hainu b'talis koton shalonu she'ein misatfin bo. Says the Mishna Berura, this is referring to our talis koton that we don't wrap ourselves with, we don't wrap our heads with, and that is, for example, the undershirt tzitzis that we know that people wear, so you're not doing itav with such a pair of tzitzis. Aval b'talis koton she'misatef bo. But a regular pair of tzitzis that we know of, that you wrap your head in it in the beginning when you make the bracha kemavur b'siv gimel, like we discussed in yesterday's shiur. So yochol lechatchila levarach lehisatev. There, where you do an itav, at least in the beginning, you can make the bracha of lehisatev. But here's a very important point. The Mishna Berura says ubidiyeved in beirach b'chol talis koton lehisatev. Any talis koton you put on, if you made the bracha of lehisatev. Or if on a talis gadol you made a bracha of al mitzvah tzitzis, even if you messed up in the bracha in either direction, yotza, you are yotze. V'dan, you should know the ein levarech al talis koton ad shi'ei al kolponim arko shloshes rivei ama l'chol tzad. A person should not make a bracha on his talis koton unless it is 3/4 of an amma on each side. V'nekav beis hatzavar eino ola min aminyan. And the neck hole does not count to the measurements. In front of the neck hole has to be 3/4 of an amma, and in the back, past the neck hole, has to be 3/4 of an amma. V'gam sheyeh pasuach rubo. It also has to be open most of the way. This is again talking about the type of undershirt tzitzis that we're familiar with, that if it's attached under the arm and then it's split underneath it, it has to be split at least majority of the way to be kosher. Even though we just said before that 3/4 of an amma is enough, but really anshe maisa are knowing to make sure that tzitzis have an amma in the front and an amma in the back. The ayin b'Mishna Berura uber alocha b'Siman tazayin mashik asafti od b'nyedzeh. We'll get to that in Mirz Hashem later. Continues the Mechaber weiter in Sev Zayin. Tzorich lahafrid chutei hatzitzis zeh mizeh. One must separate the strings of the tzitzis from each other. They shouldn't be tangled up. Says the Mishna Berura of Koton Yudches, Kol chut b'fnei atzmo, each string should be separate. Shelo yu misubochem echa b'chaver, they shouldn't be tangled up, one in its friend. If a person is running late and he gets to shul late, if he spends time separating out the strings of the tzitzis so they shouldn't be tangled, he's going to miss tefillah b'tzibur. So then the Magen Avram says one does not have to be careful about this. And he says, look in the Bir Halacha, if you pick at the first Bir Halacha, he writes, look what we wrote in the Mishna Berura b'shem the Magen Avram, that if you're running late, you're going to miss minyan. So then the Magen Avram says, don't waste your time separating the tzitzis, it's not a problem. V'tama Magen Avram hu, the reasoning of the Magen Avram, says the Bir Halacha is, Dehayom ein ze rak zecher l'zman hatcheles. Nowadays, we're really just separating the tzitzis as a commemoration for when we had tcheles in our tzitzis. In those days, you absolutely had to separate the blue strings from the white strings. However, the Gra takes issue with this Magen Avram. The Gra says you absolutely have to separate the strings even nowadays when there is no tcheles. The Olas Tamid also writes like the Gra. According to their words, if your strings of your tzitzis are tangled up one in another, according to them, you should not make the bracha until you untangle them. Or maybe it's not really any worse than gardume tzitzis, is when strings rip and you don't have the real size. So we hold that once it was the original size when you started, and now it got smaller, it's still going to be okay. Al kol panim, the bottom line says the Beralacha, lechatchila bevadai hachiyuv lahafridan imhei misubachim kodem shebarach aleihim. For sure, lechatchila, one should untangle his strings before he makes a bracha, because again, some say it's ma'akiv, some say it's not. Lechatchila, vadai, one should do it. But the bottom line is, in the Mishna Berura, the Chavetz Chaim only brings the Magen Avram, and he's telling us that in the Magen Avram, you shouldn't miss minyan b'tzibur because of untangling the tzitzis. And the last line of the Mishna Berura in Sivkot and Yudches says, Kosav Hari, Tzitzis is Roshei Tevos. Tzitzis stands for the following four words: Tzadik Yafrid Tzitzios of Tamid. A Tzadik will separate his tzitzis often. So there's a remez in the word tzitzis about this idea of separating the tzitzis and make sure they're not tangled together. Says the Mechaber Vayter in Sivches, Yechavein b'hisatvo shetzivonu HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'hisatev bo. A person should have kavana when he's wrapping himself in his tzitzis, when he's putting on his tzitzis, that Hashem has commanded us to wrap ourselves in tzitzis, kedei sheniskor kol mitzvosav la'asosam, so that we should remember all the mitzvahs to do them. As we know, the tzitzis is a zeicher for all the mitzvahs. We'll get into more details about that later, but that is a kavana that one should have when he puts on his tzitzis. Says the Mishna Berura in Sivkot and Yotes, v'zeu milvad kavana shetzar lechavim b'levisha l'kayim mitzvah tzitzis. This is an extra kavana that one must have by tzitzis besides the regular kavana, that when a person puts on his tzitzis, he has to have kavana that he's been mekayim the mitzvah of tzitzis. The kosav abach shekein hadin b'tfilin v'sukkah. Tzitzis is not the only mitzvah that you have to have the extra kavana, that besides the mitzvah, the kavana you be mekayim the mitzvah, you have kavana for the purpose of the mitzvah. We also find the same idea by tefillin and sukkah as well. After bishar mitzvahs yotze af shelo mechavim badavar. Even though by other mitzvahs we find that you're yotze even if you have no kavana, ki im sha'usa mitzvah l'shem Hashem shetziva la'asosa. As long as you have the kavana that you're doing the mitzvah that Hashem commanded, that is a kiyam of mitzvah strilas kavana. You don't need any other kavana. Only by tefillin and tzitzis and sukkah you need extra kavana. Hanoch shani, these three mitzvahs are different. Why is that? The betzitzis ksiv luman tizkaru. It says in order that you should remember. By these three mitzvahs it says luman, in order that something, and therefore that's a sign for us that you have to have this extra kavana. So by tzitzis it says luman tizkaru. Ubetfilin luman tiyatar Hashem beficha. Ubesukkah luman yedu tarasechem. And therefore once again sukkah, tefillin, and tzitzis, besides the regular kavana that every mitzvah must have, that you're being mekayim the mitzvah of Hashem, you also have the kavana for the reason of the mitzvah. Nogei lanu is tzitzis. You have to have kavana like the Mechaber says that you're putting this on to remember all of the mitzvahs Hashem has commanded us. Umikol makom nirid the kol zel lechatchila. Says the Mishna Berura, these extra kavanas for these three mitzvahs appear to be only lechatchila, kedei lekayim a mitzvah b'shleimusa. That's just the best way to mekayim it. Aval b'di'evid, af im lo kiven b'chol elu. But even if you weren't mekayim by these three mitzvahs as well, rak lekayim a mitzvah asay, you only had kavanah to mekayim the mitzvah asay, yotza, you are yotza, your mitzvah. That is the shita of most opinions hold that. There is a shita that holds not that way, but the Mishna Berura doesn't bring it down. The Afterwards, the Primigodim says the same thing. That the Gra says that even by tzitzis the kavana is not ma'akiv. Now I'd like to look at note number 23, the second paragraph. So we said that for all mitzvahs, again, this is a sugya later on we'll get to in Siman Samuch, that we pass in mitzvah sfiras kavana. You have to have a kavana that you be mekayim the mitzvah of Hashem. These three mitzvahs have the extra credit kavana that you need to have l'chatchila. But he writes in the second paragraph, note 23, a very important point. Ubediyevedim lo kivem beferish b'shas halavisha l'kayim mitzvah tzitzis. But b'diavad, even if one didn't have kavana, the regular kavana, that when he put on his tzitzis, he didn't have kavana to mekayim the mitzvah tzitzis. Re'ei masha kosa l'kavon. Look what we're going to write later on. B'shem l'chay adam shemuchach lefiha inyan. If it's clear from the situation, she'osa kedei l'kayim a mitzvah, that you're putting on the tzitzis to be mekayim the mitzvah tzitzis, yotzei yedei chova, you are yotzei. The host of the Be'alacha, Shana Be'alacha Ezran over there, Shigama Yidei Amiras HaBracha. Even if you just make the bracha on the tzitzis, Oha achona lo mitzvah, or you're sitting there getting ready and separating the strings, getting ready for the mitzvah, muchach shekavanoso lo mitzvah. Then it's clear that your kavana is for the mitzvah. V'rei ma shekasavnu sham. That's a very important kula for us. We shouldn't be worried that if one time we put on our tzitzis and we don't have kavana for the mitzvah, that we're not yotzei. There is what to rely on. There are poskim that say, and we'll discuss this more when we get to Siman Samech, that as long as it's clear from the matzav that you have kavana for the mitzvah, why else are you putting on your tefillin before davening? If not for the mitzvah, why making a bracha? So even if you're spacing out when you're doing it, as long as it's clear from the situation that you're doing a mitzvah, so that would be enough. Again, it's not the best way, but it certainly would be enough. You would be yotzei. Continues the mechaber weiter in Sif Tes. Kodem sheyavarech ya'ayim b'chutei hatzitzis imhem ksherim. Before a person makes a bracha on his tzitzis, he should check the strings and make sure they're kosher. Now we'll get into many discussions shortly of what makes the strings kosher or not, but the bottom line is, whatever those halachas will be, before you make a bracha, you want to make sure you check your strings and see that they're kosher. Kedei shelo yavarech levatala, so that your bracha should not be a bracha levatala.
At the same time as when you're unknotting them when they're all tangled. You're checking to see if the...
Yeah, you could accomplish it all at the same time. Correct. As Shalom Moshe is saying, if you're separating the tzitzis, so you could accomplish two things at the same time. You're also checking the tzitzis to make sure they're kosher in a chanami. But it's two different nakudas. One is they should be separate. Two is you have to make sure it's a kosher. You'll see in the Mishna Berura there's an added thing they have to be careful about as well. That wouldn't be pashut just from separating the strings. We'll see that in a second. Says the Mishna Berura, Sef Katan Chav Ya'ayin. You should look at your tzitzis well. Mashma Midivrei habach vel yirabah. It's mashma from the bach vel yirabah. Tegam b'Shabbos yesh livdo katalas. That this applies even on Shabbos. The Achronim are mashma, even on Shabbos you should check your strings. V'ayin b'Siman Yud Gimel b'Bir Halacha. Now if you look at note 24, he writes in the first paragraph, the Bir Halacha writes over there, Sha'olam einon nizharim bazeh. People are not careful about this. They're not checking their strings on Shabbos. U'be Bir Halacha sham kasav she'af al pi she'tzarech livdog hatzitzis b'Shabbos. The Bir Halacha writes, even though it's true that there is an inyan to check your tzitzis on Shabbos as well, mikol makom me'anochon she'be'erev Shabbos yivdog hatalas be'es ha'anocha batik. You should really check it on Friday. When you put your talis away after davening on Shabbos, check it before you put it back in your talis bag. V'ozlo yitztarech levodka b'Shabbos. Then you could avoid the necessity to check it on Shabbos. As long as you checked it before you put it away, you would not have to check it when you take it out the next morning on Shabbos. V'sham heveinu. There we brought as well, shemi sheyesh lo talis miuchedes l'Shabbos. There is an inyan to have a special talis for Shabbos. So one who has a Shabbos talis me'anochon lebotka b'motzoi Shabbos kodem she'achnisena latik. So there it's best to really check your strings on Motzei Shabbos before you put it away for next Shabbos. So a talis that you wear every day, if you're wearing the same one Friday and Shabbos, so really you should check the strings on Shabbos to make sure they're kosher. The oil doesn't do that. But what you should make sure to at least do is check it on Friday before. If you have a special Shabbos talis, make sure Motzei Shabbos when you're folding your talis and you're putting it away, make sure you check the strings and that will be good for the next time you wear it, which would be the next Shabbos. At the end of note 24, I'm not going to read it inside, there's a lengthy discussion in terms of separating the strings on Shabbos. Is that going to be a problem of tikkun and isser on Shabbos or not? That's a big machlokas in the poskim brought down in the last paragraph of note 24. But let's go weiter in the Mishna Berura. Sivkoton chaf alef b'chutei hatzitzis. Again, we said before you make a bracha, you should be analyzing your tzitzis strings. Gam tzorach levodkon lemalo b'makom nekev hatalos arakshira. Besides checking the strings and making sure they're kosher, you also want to check the top, where the hole of the garment is, where the tzitzis go through. From that point until the knots start, the sham pasal afilu benifsak chut echad. There, even if one string is cut by the hole, before the knots start, if one string is cut, the tzitzis is pasal v'ayim b'alacha. So Yisrael Moshe, that's what I was referring to before. It's true when you're separating the tzitzis, you're really checking at the same time if they're kosher. But besides the actual strings above the knots where it's attached to the garment, if even one string is ripped, it'll be pasul. As opposed to what we'll see later, if one of your strings of your tzitzis stam is ripped, it wouldn't pasul. We'll see all the details of that later. But it's very important that also to check the strings on top, because there one rip in a string pasul your tzitzis. But here the Mishna Berura of Katan Chav Beis is bothered by a Gevald Kakasha. The Mechaber says the reason we're checking our strings is because we want to make sure it's not a bracha levatala. Mishna Berura is bothered. I have a bigger problem. You can't wear a four-cornered garment without tzitzis on. That would be a daraisa, zachiv daraisa. If you're wearing a four-corner garment, to make sure you have tzitzis. So don't you want to check your strings to make sure you have tzitzis, so you're not wearing a four-corner garment without tzitzis on? So why does the mechaber skip over that reason and only tell us that we're concerned for a bracha l'vatalos? The Mishna Berura writes in Chav Beis, even though besides the problem of a possible bracha l'vatala, there's a chashash of an isser besides that. Sheyulbash beged shel arba knafos b'li tzitzis. You're going to be wearing a four-corner garment without tzitzis on it. So why is the mechaber only showing concern for the bracha l'vatala? Mikol moko mukmi le acheskase shahaya kasher. In terms of the nakuda, that you want to make sure you're not wearing a four-corner garment without tzitzis on, there we rely on the chazaka that it was kosher and we assume it's fine. So why don't we assume it's fine by the bracha? Rak mishum chomer de losisa. Just because of the chumra of the pasuk of losisa, don't say Hashem's name in vain. Sheyesh al bracha levatala, which is a problem with the bracha levatala. Hechmiru levatko. Therefore, they were machmir to check. So it's true there's a chazaka, but there's a special chumra not to be over the isra of losisa by bracha levatala. So we're machmir by bracha levatala. Ulefize, according to this, it comes out interesting. Misha lovesh kama begodim shel tzitzis. One who's wearing various garments with tzitzis on it. Ain't tzarech livdok elo echad mehem. According to this, you really only have to check one garment. Kevan de bracha achas lekulam. You're putting on 5 pairs of tzitzis, or Scheinberg's putting on many pairs of tzitzis. You're only making a bracha on 1 pair of the tzitzis, and you're pattering all of them. So you have to make sure that at least 1 pair of tzitzis is kosher, and then it's not a bracha l'vatala. So according to the mechaber, that our only concern is a bracha l'vatala, you'll be good to go by checking 1 pair of tzitzis. But according to the other concern, that we're worried that maybe you're wearing a 4-corner garment without strings, without tzitzis, you have to check every single garment. Aval ha'achronim kasvu ditzarech livdo kulam. But the achronim argue, and they say, no, it's not enough to check one of them. It's not only a problem of bracha l'vatala, we're also concerned that wearing a garment without tzitzis, and therefore you need to check every single garment. Echad, first of all, it's true there's a chazaka, but you don't rely on a chazaka when it's easy to check. It's right in front of you, so just check it. Don't rely on a chazaka. The gam, and secondly, the chazaka gruahi. This is a weaker chazaka. Why? Because strings tend to rip. They rip sometimes. So it's not a very strong chazaka. So first of all, it's right in front of you. It's efshel levarer. And number 2, it's a chazaka grua. It's a weaker chazaka because strings tend to rip, and therefore you should check every single pair of tzitzis. Therefore you should check your strings every single morning when you put on your tzitzis. And then avshei siron, even if you took it off. You took your tzitzis off, your mind went off of that pair of tzitzis. After tzarech bracha keshechozer v'lovesh. Again, we'll get to these halachas later. But if a person takes off his tzitzis and his mind is off the tzitzis, we'll get into maybe time frames later what you have to do to have your mind officially off it. But whatever situation, you took your mind off it, and now you put it back on. So you need a new bracha because you're mesiach das from the mitzvah. So even though you need a new bracha for the mitzvah, afilu hachi ain't tzarech lachzor v'livdok. But then you would not have to check the strings again. The bizman muad kazeh einu ragil lipasik. Because in a short amount of time that you took the tzitzis off and then you put it back on, even though you were mesiach das and you required a new bracha, we don't assume the strings are going to rip in such a short time. V'samchinan achazaka, and then we rely on the chazaka. And even in the morning, if through checking your strings you are going to miss out on tefillah b'tzibur, they called you up for an aliyah, and it's going to be a tircha l'tzibura, yachal lilbosh taliso b'li bedika, you can put your talis on no problem without checking it. But that's all true only if you knew that yesterday was fine. You can't rely every day assuming it has a chazaka. If yesterday you know you checked it, and today you're running up for an aliyah or you're going to miss davening, so then you would be able to put it on without checking it. But you should do the best that you can and check as much as you can, even on your way up to get your aliyah, so at least check it on your way up, do the best that you can. If a person borrowed a talus from a friend to get an aliyah, our minhag is that we don't make a bracha on a borrowed talus. You don't need to check it at all. So again, both reasons wouldn't apply. We don't make a bracha, so there's no concern of a bracha levatala. And we also hold that a borrowed talus, assuming you're not borrowing it for tefillah, for the real mitzvah, you're just borrowing it for kavod hatzibur or kavod haTorah, so then it's not even chayv and tzitzis. If you just a borrowed garment, it's not chayv and tzitzis. So even if it's missing a tzitzis and you have a 4-quarter garment without tzitzis, it's a 4-quarter garment that's potter from tzitzis. So according to both reasons, if you're just borrowing a talis for a couple of minutes, so you would not be responsible to check according to either reason. And the Mishna Berura ends off and says, "V'inboda katalis k'sheheiser osel me'alov." Like we mentioned before, if you checked your strings of your talus when you took it off, the nicho bekiso shelo, and then you put it away in its bag, ein sarach lachzor ulevodko lomocha kishemisatef bo. You don't have to check it the next morning when you put it on. So again, the same idea that we said, that if it's for Shabbos, you could check it on Friday when you put it away. If it's a Shabbos talus, you could check it Motzei Shabbos the week before, and then you would have to check it the next time you wear it on Shabbos morning. We'll stop here, and we'll continue weiter next time, Mirz Hashem, with Sif Yud.